Let's start with a look at Mauricio Pochettino's record as U.S. manager, going back to his first game in charge back on October 12th against Panama. Why are we looking at this? Well, because one of the biggest names in American soccer history isn't exactly impressed with Pochettino's work so far. Of course, I'm talking about Bruce Arena. Here's what he had to say about the new U.S. manager on a recent edition of the Unfiltered Soccer podcast with Tim Howard and Landon Donovan.
I'm sure our coach is a very good coach. Coaching international football is different than club football. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a completely different job. If you're an American coach in the U.S. team, you know the culture, you know the pride, and how important the national team is. I think when you bring in somebody from the outside, they don't understand it, and especially in our country, because we're so different. So, you ask me, do we lack that kind of pride? I mean, I'm watching, I'm shocked. I'm shocked that we can't beat Panama and Canada.
All right, so a lot to pick apart there from Bruce Arena. Gentlemen, I don't want to lead the witnesses. Your first thoughts?
Do you need to understand the U.S. culture to understand that the U.S. men's national team has never done anything of worth at the international level? I don't need to remind anybody who was at the helm when the U.S. men's national team failed to qualify for the 2018 World Cup.
It was an American guy, right?
It was an American guy. And the culture didn't...
But it's also the same American guy that got us further in any World Cup ever. So there needs to be some context.
In a World Cup where that team went 1-1 and then beat a CONCACAF nation to go on. There is context. It's a great... It's a great, but what I'm saying here is he goes on to say that no nation to ever win the World Cup has had a foreign coach. It's like 8 countries that have won the World Cup. And it's the same countries. They're world powers. If he thinks there's an American that can take this team to the next level, please, let me see this American that's going to take the U.S. men's national team to the next level. If not, you have to go to the world powers. You have to go to better coaching, better methodology. This is just, it's on brand, but it's beyond me why this comes out.
Is there any truth, Casey, to what he says?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily judge it specifically based off of you're from this country or that country. I judge based off of how you get the job done on what you're doing. And I do exactly the same thing with this similar argument on, are you an American or do you have an American passport? And I think we've seen examples where Ernie Stewart, before he ever played at DC United, had never lived in America, but there was never going to be a question of his commitment to the national team. Jermaine Jones had never lived in America, but he was 100% committed to the national team. We saw other people that weren't as committed to the national team, and we've seen other guys that were born and raised and at different times picked and choose the games they played at.
Is the question here, though, about knowledge or commitment? Because when I hear Bruce Arena saying you need a certain knowledge of the U.S. way things are done, and you're actually saying commitment, which I think is actually a fair question of Pochettino.
I think
based on some of the things we've seen, like him managing a YouTube match and not being at the press conference ahead of CONCACAF Nations League.
Seb, you're 100% on point. This isn't a matter of culture of being American. It's a matter, are you committed? We can question if Pochettino's committed. We can question if being seen at News Old Boys or YouTube charity matches with YouTubers is the way to go when you give the results you've given. 4th place in a competition of 4, where you lose to Canada, where you've lost already to Panama, where you've lost to a Mexico team that you've dominated. We can question those things. We can question what we see on the outside looking in, our perspective of Pochettino's commitment or lack thereof. But I think this is more a question of commitment than culture. I think this is where Bruce Arena got it wrong.
Casey, you were on Jurgen Klinsman's staff.
Correct.
Fair, for a little bit.
Correct.
So one of the things that we noticed with Mauricio Pochettino is he loves his staff, his guys. And he was asked directly when he took over the job, like, are you going to bring anybody in to help you better understand, whether it's the player pool or CONCACAF, whatever. Was that kind of your role within the Klinsman staff as somebody to give kind of the American perspective? And is that maybe something that Pochettino needs to do with his own staff now?
It was Tab and myself to kind of give that perspective.
So what you're saying is Klinsman held his hand up and said, I don't know it all. I need some guys.
And I think what Jurgen talked to me about was I also want the guy that was born and raised in America, developed in America, went to Europe, and started at every club he ever played for. Different managers, still won the starting role. Different countries, still won the starting role. Where it wasn't like, well, the manager doesn't like me, or this new one comes here, or they don't understand this, or I don't know the language, or, well, he did it.
Right.
And I think,
example.
and said, there's the example of how you can be raised in this culture and still be successful at the European level and the international level. And so, yeah, that was mine. And I know, look, it's different. And I understand what Bruce is saying, and Jurgen and I had these conversations as well, is, in March, most of the American guys are not watching soccer, they're watching NCAA basketball.
Is that still the case in 2025?
Yeah,
I get it in 2005 that was the case.
I don't know if it's the case.
It's not as, I don't think it's as prevalent as it was, but there still is a difference between, the countries that is so football-centric.
Isn't it just a case of go out and get the best manager possible instead of the best American manager possible?
But I also think that there's an added pressure on Pochettino because you broke the bank for it and you changed your structure.
Fair. That is fair.
And I'm sorry, if you're a striker and you come in and you break the club's transfer record and you make triple what everybody else makes, show me you're worth triple. And I think it's a combination that, yes, I agree with you that there is a point of the best, but I don't think Pochettino has proved the commitment yet. Sorry, not the commitment. I agree with you too. The commitment on what he's done as a manager, but also the commitment from U.S. Soccer by getting the hedge fund guys to pay for this and break the bank and do all that.
What were the differences for you between Bob Bradley, who you played for at the national team level, who is kind of, a second generation of Bruce Arena, really truly an American soccer person, and then when you had Jurgen Klinsman in charge? Like, was there something missing? Was there something added? What was the difference having a tried and true American versus somebody who, really had very little attachment to American soccer culture at that point?
It's funny, oddly enough, Bob would show you videos of Barcelona, Chelsea, all these teams, all these European teams, and
because he knew you guys weren't watching it.
Well, no, if there were players who would be watching, there's a lot of students of the game in that era. But
I played against those teams.
Exactly. but Jurgen would try to get you to embrace the American side. Jurgen would try to get you to understand who you're representing, which I think is super valuable as well.
Right.
They're different, but eerily similar.
Yeah.
People think Jurgen is this, foreign product. He's German. He's the most non-German German I've met in my life. That's Jurgen Klinsman. He's California through and through today. That's who he is. They both deeply care about the country and their game. I didn't find it too differently outside of the styles, which were deeply different in contrast. Yes.
One of the things that Bruce Arena points to is he says, we're so different. And I think that's interesting because it speaks to kind of the unique nature of U.S. soccer culture. I guess the point that you might make when you say, well, there's pressure on Pochettino because he's brought in for so much money is you've gone with a $6 million a year outside of the box guy because you don't really want the same thing that we've had over and over again. And I think beyond that, with what Bruce Arena says, when you paint with a broad brush and you say, well, foreigners can't understand the United States, I think that's when you get in trouble, right? The United States didn't invent soccer. You can find certainly somebody who could understand the game better than an American coach and learn this pool to a way where they could get something out of it. What I think his criticism would be better served at is if it was directly at Pochettino, because that's where I think you can say, you've got a guy with no international experience.
Correct.
You've got a guy with no CONCACAF experience. You've got a guy who won't bring in somebody who's a former U.S. player to help him understand the pool, and then the results. And I remember watching you guys after they lost to Panama. You guys pointed out two things, which to me were red flags, that this guy didn't really know either the pool he had at his hands or the competition he was in. One were some of the decisions he made that were totally based on January camp, right? You're bringing this guy in because he played well in January. You don't really understand your pool. The other thing is against Panama, Panama's had the same coach forever. You know exactly what Panama's going to do, and this team seemed surprised by it. I guess so. To me, if Bruce Arena's saying you got to have somebody that knows the region and this pool a little bit, and Poch isn't that guy, I accept that. I just don't think you can paint with the broad brush.
Now, my argument would be
he seems. I will say this: Pochettino seems to me right now unprepared,
and I would
underprepared.
And I would agree with that. And I think the problem that I have is, yes, there's that little bit of an issue because you don't have your players day in and day out. So then you have to spend that time getting to know the player pool you have. And let's be honest, you don't have 60, 80, 100 player pool. You have a 10-person player pool and another 10 people if you have some injuries. And that's the core that you really need to know. I mean, let's look at that list right there. You're looking at, okay, McKinney, Pulisic, Weah,
Adams
Scally
when healthy.
to a point, Adams when he's healthy, Turner because we're still trying to figure out the goalkeeping situation. But and then you add, Gio, you add, maybe.
I'm looking at 9 World Cup starters. I'm looking at 8 or 9 World Cup starters here.
Well, and that's the point where you're saying those are 10. Those plus maybe 5 other guys that you really have to know. And then you got to figure out the others that can fill in gaps for you.
I don't buy the argument if you don't know CONCACAF. There is no World Cup qualifying. Okay, you don't need to know CONCACAF. My worry is that he's had enough time with this group and he still can't identify who can help him. He's picking guys that he's seen in January camp as if that's the only pool of players that he spent some time with, and that's a problem. While he was doing these YouTube charity matches, while he was at Newell's Old Boys having fun, while he's been at Tottenham, while he's been giving interviews about one day going back, while he's doing all these different things and accepting $6 million a year, we didn't see Mauricio Pochettino talking to Christian Pulisic in Milan. We didn't see him visiting Juventus. We didn't see him going and talk to Matt Turner and to Chris Richards, asking them how their day-to-day is. We didn't see him going out and seeing dual nationals who are a possibility. What we saw was him having fun. So when the Nations League rolls around, even before the Nations League, these shouldn't surprise us. These outings should not surprise us.
He actually, I think, was quoted as saying the opposite, that I don't really want to meet with these people. I want to have this fresh perspective. Well, fresh perspective is great when you're a club manager and you can then go buy who you want.
Correct.
These are the only players you have. And here's this core that are better than everyone else. That core better be bought into what you're doing. And you have to figure that stuff out. And I feel like we felt all along that there isn't the commitment, particularly since you don't know these guys for a long period of time. So you better dive in and you better cram for that test, and we're not seeing it.
I know there were a lot of injuries with the Final Four players.
And Panama had no injuries?
Panama had a lot of injuries.
Panama had their B team.
Defensive injuries. But what I'm saying is when they need a goal, and he's not putting on Giovanni Reyna. I don't care if Gio's on one leg.
That sounds like a guy who doesn't really
know who he has at his disposal.
Yeah. Right. All right, so obviously this was a topic of